And then I guess we're going to have some questions after that and some time for some conversation. But it really is an honor to be here. I mean, we're talking about something that I really care about a lot, which is the intersection of faith and believers in the mainstream media, of which, you know, I'm one of the few. And I think if we're talking about media and journalism, and the term fake news is part of the title, then we know that, you know, we have a problem, right? And the current perception of the media, it's been a lot better, right? And I like this cartoon from the Christian Science Monitor where a couple is watching some news channel, and the guy says to the gal, he says, "Want to watch the left-wing media or the right-wing media?" And she says, "Remember, it was just news." And I like this one where this guy actually hooked up a lie detector to his television set. It doesn't give us the station that he's on there, but he says he hooked it up because I don't know which channel I should believe anymore. And I think a lot of people are feeling that lack of trust in the media. And I mean, we've probably noticed if you come from a more conservative background, a worldview, that a lot of times the bias does seem to be more on the liberal side, right? And so here's a guy bursts into the editor's room and he says, "Trump just cured cancer." And then the headline the next day in the paper says, "President's healthcare plan ignores heart disease." And as a as a believer in the media, I want to answer one big question here tonight. So this is what I want to make the focus of my conversation. And that's this: is the mainstream media, even in the fake news era, any place for a church-going, Bible-believing, born-again Christian? And I use that term, church-going, Bible-believing, born-again Christian, because that's how I would describe myself. I mean, I read the Bible, I apply it to my life. I'm a follower of Christ. I would say I'm doctrinally an evangelical Christian category. And so my answer to that big question is yes, and I'm going to explain my answer here tonight, and we can talk about it and when we have some discussion. But I wrote about this actually. That's how I described myself when I wrote a column about my faith and my journalism a few years ago. Actually, it's 2018 for ProPublica and the New York Times. I wrote about my journey from ministry. I was in full-time ministry for 5 years. I went to seminary and got a master's degree in theology, and then I became a journalist in the mainstream media. So I'm going to talk about that journey a little bit here tonight. I think it's important first that we define what is journalism. And I learned a lot when I read this book called The Elements of Journalism. Back in 2001, the book came out, and that's coincidentally when I became a full-time journalist. And I never had any formal journalism training. So I like to tell students, if you're studying journalism right now, you're going to be far ahead of where I was when I started. I kind of started with some instincts and some ideas, and then I had to, basically I plunged in and figured it out as I went. But these elements of journalism, Bill Kovac and Tom Rosenstiel boiled it down to 9 essential elements. One, journalism's first obligation is to the truth. We want to be reporting what's true. Its first loyalty is to citizens. So we're really doing journalism in the public interest when we're doing journalism with integrity. Its essence is a discipline of verification. Its practitioners must maintain an independence from those that they cover. It must serve as an independent monitor of power. That word independence is really important. Every journalism outlet I've ever worked at in my career has had a very strict ethics policy where I'm not allowed to take any gifts, even a cup of coffee. I'm not allowed to have anybody buy me lunch because we don't want any appearance of conflict of interest with the reporting that I do. If I do any freelance writing, I have to talk to my editors about it and make sure that it's approved by them. Again, we just want to make sure we're totally independent of the people we report about. Journalism, number 6, must provide a forum for public criticism and compromise. And criticism, I think, is a key word there. You know, journalists focus on things that are problems in society and really monitor those things. It must strive to make the significant interesting and relevant. Journalism must keep the news comprehensive and proportional. And number 9 is a really important one to me. Practitioners must be allowed to exercise their personal conscience. And I can say as again, a church-going, Bible-believing, born-again Christian, I personally have never had a situation in the media where I've been asked to compromise my personal conscience. So that has not been something that has been a problem for me. What about though believers and muckraking, like a Christian doing investigative reporting, which is what I do, where you're really exposing wrongdoing? Is that something a Bible believing born again Christian should be engaged in? It kind of sounds a little nefarious, right? But if we look at the definition of muckraking, it says to search out and publicly expose real or apparent misconduct of a prominent individual or business. I think if we use that definition and we're doing it with integrity, with these other principles in mind in the public interest, I believe personally that muckraking is something that a Bible believing born again Christian could and should be engaged in. I now work for ProPublica. I've been at ProPublica for almost a decade. ProPublica is one of the largest investigative news organizations in the country right now. We're based in New York City. We also have offices in Illinois. We have an office in Washington, D.C., opening branches in Atlanta and Phoenix, Arizona. And so we're really trying to blanket the country with investigative journalism at the local level and at the national level. And this is our mission. It says to expose abuses of power and betrayals of the public trust by government, business, and other institutions using the moral force of investigative journalism to spur reform through the sustained spotlighting of wrongdoing. And I love that term moral force. Again, as a believer in the media, reading the Bible, believing in right and wrong, in this age of postmodernism and relativism where we like to think that everybody can kind of do whatever they want, investigative reporting in particular is identifying things that are wrong and it's calling them out. And so it's using this term moral force is something that if I were to have written a mission statement for an organization myself, I like the term moral force. I mean, that really suits my worldview as a Bible believing born again Christian. Again, sometimes it still makes people squeamish. In churches, and more conservatively minded folks can be skeptical of the media. And so I like to point to Luke 1 through 4, just the beginning, where Luke, when he starts off his gospel, explains his purpose in writing the book of Luke. And he says, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. And so I love that term, carefully investigated. I mean, Luke actually dug in, he investigated, he talked to people who could tell these stories themselves so that the readers of Luke could know the certainty of the things that they've been taught. And again, if we're thinking about this from an investigative reporting or muckraking perspective, I'm not saying that Luke was an investigative reporter. I'm just saying that there are some parallels in what Luke did and what I do or what other journalists do. And let's even look at some of the controversial truth telling by Luke in the Gospel of Luke, because there is quite a lot of it. In chapter 11, Jesus really takes on the religious powerhouses of the day and calls them out in a way that's extremely controversial. In chapter 14, he says, anybody who does not hate his father or mother is not worthy of being a disciple. Luke talks about the exclusivity of Christ and says many will not be able to enter through the narrow door. Luke shows Jesus driving the sellers and money changers out of the temple. Luke talks about Judas betraying Jesus. And again, we think about the portrayal of one of the main disciples, one of the main followers of Christ, exposed by Luke as a scoundrel. Luke had the audacity to document this story and then publish the thing for thousands of years later. We're still reading about Judas. How about this one, Luke 22, after the Last Supper, the disciples are arguing with one another about who will be the greatest. I mean, again, these are the disciples of Jesus portrayed as petty, ego-driven children. And the classic one, maybe the worst of them all, I guess Judas might be qualified as the worst, but Peter denying Christ 3 times. I mean, Peter is the rock upon which the church is built. Luke, when documenting his story, exposes him as a hypocrite. And this has just had to have been one of the most shameful moments of Peter's life, right there in writing for all time. So just in terms of my own career path, I started as a missionary in Kenya. My wife and I worked on staff with Young Life. And from Young Life, I went to Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California, and I got a master's degree in theology. And it was really when we came back from Kenya that I started doing some freelance writing. And so I started in the Christian media because I was going to seminary. I had been in full-time ministry, and so that was the most natural place to start. And so I did a lot of writing for places like Breakaway Magazine or Boundless Webzine. Those are focused on the family publications. I wrote for the Promise Keepers founder, Bill McCartney, was doing some radio commentaries called Fourth and Goal. I did a lot of those commentaries. And then I wrote quite a bit for Christianity Today. When I was in Southern California, I was their Southern California correspondent and wrote a lot of stories for them too. And one of the things I really enjoyed, and I'm thankful for getting my start in Christian media, but one of the big challenges I had was when it came to doing more investigative type stories in the Christian media, I might identify a Christian leader doing something unethical, misusing ministry funds, or having conflicts of interest in what they're doing that are not disclosed to their people in their ministry. And especially when I was doing these stories for Christianity Today, I really ended up butting heads with the editors. It just wasn't, the stories got softened, the stories got killed. It wasn't encouraged to do that type of investigative reporting, the muckraking style in the Christian media, from my experience. And in 2001, when I was finishing in seminary, I was really at this crossroads, and I was trying to decide, should I go into the mainstream media or should I go into the Christian media? And so I went to the Evangelical Press Association conference that was being held in San Diego that year. And I really enjoyed getting to know a lot of the people at that conference, and I learned a lot from a lot of their sessions. But one day during one of the lunches, it was sponsored by the Israel Ministry of Tourism, and they announced with a lot of fanfare and a lot of applause that they were accepting a major grant from the Israel Ministry of Tourism so that we could do the conference the next year in Jerusalem. And there was going to be special subsidized airfare, there was going to be special hotel deals. And so this was celebrated, right? This is going to be great. And it would have been great, but they were talking about how, you'll be able to walk where Jesus walked and write stories from Jerusalem. And but I was uncomfortable the whole time. I didn't have a real grounding in journalism ethics, but I felt uncomfortable that if we're taking a big grant from the Israel Ministry of Tourism and we're getting subsidized special airfare and hotels, wouldn't we need to disclose that to our readers that these stories were underwritten or partially funded by the Israel Ministry of Tourism, because we are accepting generous gifts in order to do this journalism. And so you would want your reader to know how you're being influenced, possibly, so that they could judge the stories on their merits. In the mainstream media, this type of arrangement would not have been appropriate. And so I even ended up pitching a story about it to the American Journalism Review. I wrote the story, I turned in the draft in August of 2001, and then September 11th happened. The world completely changed. They canceled the conference in Jerusalem. I ended up having a story about a conflict of interest that wasn't going to take place because they canceled the whole thing. So they paid me a kill fee and I moved on. But it was interesting to me that the Christian media did not appear to me in these situations, at least, to be following these elements of journalism. And again, who's the loyalty to? Is it to the citizens or is it to the Christian leaders? Is it to the famous pastors who might look bad if we do a story about something they're doing that's unethical? Or is it to the people in the pews who would be our readers? So I think that, for me, the loyalty needs to be to the public. I was running into some headwinds, I think, because some of the loyalty seemed to be more to the leaders or the institutions themselves. And again, it's that principle of independence, number 4 and 5, that I felt like my experience, just a few times when I was trying to investigative stories, I was finding that the media outlets did not seem to be independent from the community that they were a part of, and that made it very difficult to do more investigative stories. Um, so if the Christian media wasn't following the elements of journalism, then what would I call what I saw it doing? And I hesitate to be this critical. Okay, this is just my experience on a few different occasions, but I have talked to a lot of other journalists who've worked in the Christian media. So I do think that my experience was not totally unique, but I think propaganda might be one word that could be used. I mean, if you look at the definition of propaganda, it's information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. I mean, I think in some cases there was an element of propaganda to it. PR for God. I mean, sometimes I might think about it like that, but the issue I would have there is that God doesn't need us to do PR for him. What God calls us to do is tell the truth, speak truth to power, have integrity in everything we do. And that's not the model that we see again with the authors of the Bible, who I believe were inspired by the Holy Spirit, like to write the book of Luke. If Luke was thinking about not making Christian leaders look bad, Luke would have written a completely different gospel. We would not have gotten these the stories that we have. So that being said, there are some really promising Christian media outlets. So I don't want to just be critical of all of them. I've been really encouraged by the Roy's report. I don't know if you all have followed Julie Roy's and her work, but she came out of Moody Radio and started this outlet on her own. And she's done a lot of really hard-hitting, great investigative work. My friend Paul Glatter over at King's College runs Religion Unplugged. I think they're doing excellent work, especially international stories about religion. And then Ministry Watch, Warren Cole Smith running that organization, and Ministry Watch has started also publishing some really excellent stories, and they definitely have, if you're not familiar with their ministry, they're really being kind of a stewardship watchdog for anybody who would give to different ministries. And so they're holding ministries accountable for the way they use their donors' money. And I think they've been publishing some great stuff. So back to me back in 2001 when I'm doing this, you know, I've just come from the Evangelical Press Association conference. I've butted heads with some editors at Christianity Today in particular. And so I had to ask the question back then, is the Christian media the place for me as a church-going, Bible-believing, born-again Christian who I felt called to investigative reporting? And so that's really where I'm unique. I think, of course, you can be a Bible-believing, church-going, born-again Christian in the Christian media. It's just for me as an investigative reporter, I had to answer that question. No, it was not the place for me. And I think that's unfortunate because I wish that the Christian media would be more open to that type of journalism. So I started off. I left Fuller Seminary and I started working for several small newspapers in the Los Angeles area. I spent about 5 years at 3 different little tiny papers. The first place I started was a twice weekly community paper. I was going to school board meetings. I was going to city council meetings, covering the cops beat. I went on to 2 different daily papers. And then that was about 5 years of my career. And I think it's really valuable for journalists to start at the bottom. You learn a ton about time management, news judgment, interviewing, investigative reporting. When you're doing a story or 2 stories a day, you really start building your chops as a journalist. In 2006, I went to the Las Vegas Sun, and the Las Vegas Sun at the time was, again, it's kind of an ironic, kind of funny place for a, you know, morally conservative Christian to wind up in Sin City, right? But that's where God brought us, and we were thankful to be there. And it just so happened that at that time, the Las Vegas Sun was really focused on doing hard-hitting investigative stories, a lot of multimedia. They were very ahead of their time with their digital-first mindset with their journalism. And that's also where I started covering healthcare. And in 2010, this project came out, which was kind of the culmination of a lot of years of reporting for me in Las Vegas, called Do No Harm. And it was just about patient safety problems in hospitals in Las Vegas. And this was a project that I did with a colleague, Alex Richards, who did some really amazing data analysis. And I would say this is the story that more put me on the national map. And eventually, in 2011, then I came to ProPublica, where I've been covering healthcare ever since. As I mentioned, ProPublica is one of the largest investigative reporting organizations in the country right now. All we do is watchdog journalism, hard-hitting investigative stories. We take weeks or even months on each story, and we're funded by philanthropy. Individual donors, major foundations fund us, and anyway, it's been a great place to work, and I'm very proud of the work that my colleagues are doing there. When I came to ProPublica, I really wanted to continue to work using data analysis. And so my colleague Olga Pierce and I obtained a lot of publicly available data for Medicare, which is the federal government's health plan for people over age 65 or people who are disabled. And we did this project we called our surgeon scorecard. And really what we did was analyze this data, come up with a methodology to identify injuries and infections suffered by patients during common elective surgeries, like hip replacements and knee replacements and spinal fusions and other procedures. One of the biggest problems in healthcare is that you can't really tell where to go for a high quality operation. And surgeons and hospitals have varying degrees of quality. And so this was the first time we put together a searchable database so that people could look up surgeons by name in their community and identify who had the highest and the lowest complication rates on these common procedures. In 2017, I spent a year studying and reporting and writing about wasted healthcare spending. They estimate that our healthcare system wastes about $750 billion a year. It's about 1 in every 5 or 1 in every $4 spent on healthcare is estimated to be wasted. And so I went on a quest to identify all these examples of wasted healthcare spending and show why that drives up the cost of our healthcare in ways that are not sustainable. And for the last couple years before the pandemic hit, I was really digging deep on the health insurance industry. And again, looking at the absurd and confounding way we pay for healthcare and showing how that drives up the cost of healthcare for you and me and everybody else in the country. These projects ended up leading to my first book, which is scheduled to come out in June with Penguin Random House, called Never Pay the First Bill and Other Ways to Fight the Healthcare System and Win. It just went up on Amazon today, so you can actually pre-order a copy. I'd be very happy. It will help, hopefully, maybe, possibly, if I sell enough, pitch in toward tuition for my kids for college. But anyway, this is really a guide based on what I've learned investigating the healthcare industry for the last 15 years to show ways that individual patients can save hundreds or thousands of dollars with every healthcare interaction just by fighting back, learning how the system works, and sticking up for themselves. And of course, this year, right now we're living it. We're all remote in this particular talk because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so as a healthcare journalist, this has been just the complete focus of my year. We did stories about the CDC trying to create its own test early on in the pandemic, failing, making mistakes as they did it, which then allowed the spread of the coronavirus. I've done a lot of stories from the front lines talking to nurses about the lack of protective equipment that they've had in hospitals and their attempts to provide their own and then even being disciplined for it. I don't know if you heard about the viral pandemic video, but I did a story about trying to help people discern a little bit about conspiracy theories. And so I talked about these are the questions I asked of this very popular viral video to help people try and discern what's good information and bad information. And then I've been doing some stories too about price gouging. A lot of people during the pandemic, some healthcare providers, I should say, see it as an opportunity to profit instead of care for the public. And so this story I did was about a doctor who worked for a freestanding emergency room in Texas, who went to his own employer for a test. They charged his insurance plan $10,984 for a test that took about 5 minutes to administer. And even more shocking is that his insurance company paid the whole bill. So back to my big question. So um, is the mainstream media in the fake news era any place for a church-going, Bible-believing, born-again Christian? Okay, so there's an elephant in the room. What about the bias, right? We do have media bias. And in fact, I think since Trump has been elected, I think it's become more overt, more exposed, and a much bigger problem. In fact, I think the bias in the media, and by bias, I'm talking about, I think there is a lack of diversity of worldviews in the media. I mean, I'm certainly a fish out of water with where I'm coming from in the mainstream media. And so I do think that the media has a credibility problem in some cases with some types of coverage, especially I'd say with political coverage. So what about the bias? I mean, how does that affect me? Well, I think my answer there is that the bias really doesn't affect me. I mean, it has not impeded my ability to do my job. It might be because I cover healthcare and not politics, but I come up with my own story ideas. I pitch them to my editors. What my editors really want are really good stories. And so as long as I'm delivering good stories, my editors are happy and affirming of the work that I do. Again, I'm very open about my faith, so I've never felt like being a Christian has held me back. In fact, on the contrary, I think right now, especially at the upper elite levels of the media, there's a real understanding of this problem of the lack of intellectual worldview diversity in the media. And so I think it's time for, if you're a Christian student or a Christian journalist, I think that you should um, be open about your faith. I would encourage believers, if they're applying for jobs, to include your church attendance or some type of church involvement on your resume so that people can see that you might come from a little different background than their typical applicant for a job. My resume had my seminary background and my ministry background. So my resume was very obvious. And I found it's a lot easier to be open about your faith if you're just open about it from the get-go, right? And I don't think that's going to hold you back. And in fact, I think it might even be an asset as you're looking for a job. And then I would also say, do not be anxious or afraid. I mean, there's no doubt that there are people who have questioned my faith. There's always, in every newsroom I've been in, there's some smart mouth atheist who thinks that he's going to point out how my faith is weak or not. I'm not intellectually rigorous or whatever. But the Bible talks about don't be anxious, don't be afraid. In every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And I think anytime you feel like a fish out of water as a believer, we're not alone. Christ is with us. We're not being persecuted, at least in the United States. And so we really don't have anything to be anxious or afraid about. That brings me to the end of this conversation, at least in terms of my formal prepared remarks. So I'll stop the screen sharing here, and I guess, Rich, we're open to questions here, or I'm not sure how you want to proceed from here.
We are. I wanted to ask you about something you just touched on.
Yeah.
I think there's a notion out there, I think it's more than just me, that being obvious about your Christianity is going to hurt your job prospects or hurt your career. And you're saying that the opposite might actually be the case. And is that because there's a curiosity about Christians, or is there a genuine effort to bring people in with different faith backgrounds into these mainstream organizations?
There's a genuine effort to bring people in with different backgrounds into mainstream media organizations. There is a recognition. Now, they typically would define diversity more in terms of race and ethnicity. So it's kind of ironic, for me as a white male to be sort of a member of an underrepresented group in the media. But I am. I mean, and people recognize that. I mean, when I applied for a job at the Pasadena Star News, I wrote about this in the column I wrote about my faith, but I had this grizzled editor, asking me when I was interviewed, he kind of goes, what makes you think that a Christian can be a good journalist? He was trying to put me on the defensive, and I explained to him, the Bible, as a follower of Christ and as a follower of what the Bible teaches, the Bible talks about telling the truth. Journalism is about telling the truth. The Bible, the prophets from the Bible spoke truth to power. Journalists speak truth to power. There are quite a few parallels when you really think about it. It's just that there's that lack of diversity, and so there is a lack of appreciation for what it means to be a genuine person of faith. So in terms of how much they're actually doing about it, um, every place that's ever hired me has had that recognition and has had that understanding that I bring a different perspective to the table that's valuable in the newsroom. But that doesn't mean that everybody has that. I mean, you really don't know. But I just think it makes it a lot easier if you're open about your faith. It also, there's camaraderie. Like when I wrote that column, I heard from journalists in newsrooms all over the country. I mean, there's a great camaraderie for those of us who are believers in the media. We know each other, we're encouraging one another, we have a little network of our own, we support one another. Um, so um, I think it's an asset, and I think it's not something that we should shy away from being open about.
I want to open it up to questions, either orally or you can send them in via chat. As they're coming in, let me ask you another question. This one about healthcare. For years, we've been hearing through various administrations that if we could just do something about waste, fraud, and abuse, we could fix the healthcare system. But no one seems to be able to do anything about waste, fraud, or abuse. Why can't we? Why can't we deal with those issues?
They can do something about it. They don't want to do something about it. And the reality, there's a source of mine who I quote in my book. I love this line of his. He says, "Healthcare isn't broken, it was made this way." And when you look at the power and money in healthcare, healthcare makes up about 1/5 of our economy. And the healthcare corporations and really wealthy, powerful individuals in the industry pay tens of millions of dollars a year to our elected officials. And so when our elected officials put laws into place, some of those laws are literally written first drafts by the lobbyists representing the industry itself. And I don't think that the politicians are ever going to solve our healthcare problem. And I don't think that the industry itself is ever going to suddenly start saying, well, let's just start taking less money so that everybody isn't so oppressed by our high prices. I mean, we spend about twice as much per person in the United States for healthcare than the citizens of any other developed country in the world. And yet, we have about 1 in 6 Americans has medical debt in collections. We have about 50 million Americans who are either uninsured or have no insurance. And so we're spending twice as much and we're getting way less for our money. And it's not an accident. If they wanted to fix this, they could. I think that what I've come to is that really the power players don't want to fix it. They want to just keep taking more of our money, making us pay more for less. That's why I wrote my book. I mean, so my book is really um, almost like a manifesto, right, of all these things I've learned and the conclusions I've come to. It has a lot of examples, but then it also has the tactics that people can use to fight back and win, and that's what people are doing. If you just know what to do and how to do it, you can actually win these battles. So that's why I'm encouraging people to take the fight on themselves because no one's going to do it for them.
It's a question that I got earlier today from someone who couldn't be here about COVID-19. And it became a political issue, as most things do, but COVID in particular became an election issue. And much was made about what the administration did or didn't do at the outset. In your opinion, could this administration, the current administration, have done more, or was their response adequate?
I think it's been a complete failure across the board. Again, if you go back to the fact that we spend twice as much per person in the United States on healthcare than the citizens of any other country in the world, on average of all the developed countries. And our response to this pandemic has been a complete travesty. And it starts with Trump. Trump downplayed the pandemic from the beginning. He mocked it, he undermined it. And what we really needed was a public health message from the top that was unifying, that was helping people stay cautious. But it's not just Trump. I mean, so it would be wrong to say it was just Trump. because the CDC botched, that first story we did was about how the CDC really botched the first coronavirus test. Other countries were using a test that had been working. The CDC decided to design their own test, which took weeks longer. And every week mattered a lot early on in this pandemic. So the CDC designed their own test, and then they screwed it up. They contaminated it. So the test didn't work. So they sent that test out to labs all over the country, and that test did not work. And so that caused weeks or months of delay where that virus was spreading throughout the United States. We didn't have the testing capacity to identify it or even to quantify it. And so it made it a lot easier for people to take it less seriously. So there are multiple problems. It's a lack of investment in public health. Again, people invest in healthcare in the United States only in the areas that make people a lot of money. Public health does not make anyone a lot of money. Public health is really like storing up provisions in case there's a pandemic. We had no personal protective equipment, or not enough, for healthcare frontline workers because we hadn't put away enough in the storehouses for this type of pandemic. And it wasn't because we didn't know a pandemic would come. They knew a pandemic would come. They didn't prepare for it. They didn't invest in it because they're investing in things that are going to drive big profits. We have a very profit-driven healthcare industry. So the blame goes all around, but it's an absolute shame. It's a total travesty. Um, you know, other countries have kids in school right now. My best friend's a teacher in Korea. I just messaged him the other day on WhatsApp, and I said, "Hey man, are you guys still in school?" He's like, "Oh yeah, we're in school. We've got our sports going. We're doing our school play." And meanwhile, my kids and every other child across the country is on Zoom. And that's a failure of our entire system. So it starts at the top, but the blame goes across the board.
I have a question from a student. What advice would you give young people regarding research that they can do to learn? And this comes from someone with a chronic condition. What advice would you give young people who need to really learn about the healthcare system and how to navigate through it?
So especially if you have a chronic condition, I would recommend that you join some of the online forums, Facebook groups, or other social media groups. You know, the internet has changed everything, and especially for people managing chronic conditions, there are a lot more ways that they can get connected and find support and find ideas with one another. And you know, there are so many specialized things that people need that it would be hard for me to know, but I would get connected with other patients through social media channels who have experienced the same type of disease or whatever it is that you or your family is dealing with, and look for help there. Like when we were doing stories about patient safety, we do a lot of crowdsourcing at ProPublica, and we started what we call the ProPublica Patient Safety Facebook group for anybody who had ever been harmed or had a loved one harmed while undergoing medical care. And I moderated that group for about 6 years before we turned it over to some patient safety advocates. But that group had over 6,000 people in the group. And unfortunately, new people joining as people suffered medical errors or hospital-acquired infections and were unfortunately stonewalled a lot of times by the medical community. You know, they came there looking for help and looking for comfort and encouragement. And so I think the online forums can be a great place to find that. You're also going to find some really, you know, strange people online too. As you know, in any online forum, there's going to be good, and then there's going to be a little bit of crazy mixed in there too.
Catherine, you want to take one on the chat?
Yeah, I had one from Anna. She asked, she said, in Matthew 18:15, we're told to go to one another one-on-one to confront sin or wrongdoing in a brother or sister. How do you see this as compatible with muckraking?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say that's certainly a description for me if I have a you know, concern with someone who I have a relationship with in my life. I mean, you should definitely go to that person directly. And I would say that I'm practicing Matthew 18. Whenever I go to anybody I'm writing a story about, I always go directly to them. I ask them to, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, help me understand what the issue is. Usually by the time we're writing stories about these problems, so no, I would say it doesn't apply. I mean, that would be my general response would be Matthew 18 is talking about interpersonal relationships between individuals. If people are publicly causing harm to the population or the public, I don't see that as a direct Matthew 18 parallel. So I think that would be my general response to it. But I would also add that in any story I do, I go directly to the person I'm writing the story about. I ask them for their side of the story. There's multiple sides to every story. I make sure that they, you know, explain it to me. And if they explain it to me and I'm wrong, then there's no story. I mean, then I don't have a story. So I always give people a chance to respond. I very fairly and accurately and respectfully ask them. And then I also fairly and accurately and respectfully include their comments in the story. So I don't know if that, hopefully that answers the question.
Here's one from one of my students, Annie. She asks, how do you navigate being open about your faith as a journalist? And do you find that people are afraid you might come across as judgmental or preachy? And she adds that it seems to be a common misconception about Christians.
Yeah, I think unfortunately we've been, some of us who are like, I know a lot of Christians who are not judgmental and who are not preachy, and who are very comfortable, you know, being among people who are not believers. And so I think mainly it's just you're in relationship with other people, they get to know who you are. You know, I'm doing my stories, they're doing their stories. I mean, I'm not there in a newsroom, you know, judging my colleagues. I mean, if my colleagues are not believers, I'm not holding them to the same standard of like a biblical lifestyle or something like that, that you would hold another believer to, right? And so I think as Christians, we need to realize that we're surrounded by people every day who are not in agreement with us about what we believe, and they're not submitted to the same standards that we have chosen to submit ourselves to. So if I have colleagues who don't believe in God or don't believe in what the Bible says, that isn't a real, I'm not surprised by that, right? I mean, I wouldn't expect anything different from them. But then what I want to do is live out my faith in the most genuine way I can, love them unconditionally for who they are, whether we agree or disagree about certain issues. And I have found that I have great relationships with people at work. And unfortunately, I've had people, you know, in one newsroom I was in, a girl who she graduated from Yale, and she told me that I was the only Christian that she had ever known in her entire life. And it's hard for me to believe that, but you know, a lot of times people are in a secular bubble just in the same way that we as Christians can be in a Christian bubble. You know, we don't mix with enough people from worldviews that are different than ours, and we don't kind of, you know, have a meal with them or get a cup of coffee with them or have a conversation in the break room with them. And so we can easily start, you know, looking at it as us versus them, right? And pointing fingers at people who believe one way or people who believe another way. And that's really a lot of the reason we have this big divide in our country right now, is that, you know, conservatives want to point at liberals as if they're doing everything wrong, and liberals want to point at conservatives as if everything they do is wrong. The politicians feed the division, the media profits from the division. And so especially on cable news, they foment controversy and they foment division because it sells advertising and it draws big ratings. And that is not, I mean, we need more people to be bridge builders with one another and actually having relationships with one another. So that's a long answer to your question. I hope it helps. But
I have a question. I want to take you back to what you said about Christian media outlets, and they're shying away from doing real investigative journalism for whatever reason. I guess what is Christian media missing? I mean, I guess you could extend it to entertainment too, but it seems to me that there's a missed opportunity there on the part of Christian media and Christian entertainment to reach not just other Christians, but a broad audience of people who don't believe.
I mean, I think it's a huge missed opportunity because it ends up compromising your testimony. And I think a genuine testimony would be to stand up for what's true, even if it makes somebody look bad. I always believe, you want people to repent of their sin and turn from it. But usually by the time the journalist gets involved, the person is so dug in and entrenched in their position that they're sticking to their guns. When you publish the story though and put things out there, it's a powerful, like sunlight is the best disinfectant. It really does either force people to change or at least it informs the community about what's going on. So I think there's a big missed opportunity to help uphold the integrity of our church. We should be the ones that are having these conversations, and unfortunately, it ends up being covered maybe in the mainstream media, and then the Christian media might jump on board and cover it after it's been covered by someone else. But we also end up letting the mainstream media define who we are, which is also a missed opportunity. Again, like that idea that a lot of my colleagues in the media, they think about, well, what's a Christian? And they go, oh, well, it's like Jerry Falwell, right? I mean, obviously it's just Jerry Falwell because he's the guy that's on CNN all the time. So that must be a Christian, right? And I don't really know any Christians who are coming from Falwell's, perspective in terms of how politically minded he is or how politically driven he has been. And I guess I'm thinking more of Jerry Falwell Sr., but you could also apply the same thing to Jerry Falwell Jr. And so, the everyday faithful Christians who are loyal disciples of Christ, living out a godly, righteous life, they're not the ones that get quoted in the media, and so the mainstream media ends up with a very distorted picture of our faith. And I think that's unfortunate.
Catherine, do you have another?
Just a question from Heather about where we can find your book.
Well, it just got posted on Amazon, so you can pre-order it. But it's, I don't know where it'll end up showing up. I mean, if we ever go back to bookstores, I mean, it's published through Penguin Random House, which is a big publisher, so that's really good. So I'm hoping that they'll have it everywhere. It's supposed to publish in June, so hopefully by then. But if you go on Amazon, I was just looking, I'll put the link in the chat, because I was psyched. It just came up on Amazon today.
I have another question from another student. It's a non-traditional path to journalism, from seminary
Yeah.
to local newspapers. I don't know that I know anybody who's taken that path necessarily.
Yeah.
How did your ministry background, or how does it inform your work as a journalist now, and how has it in the past?
That's a really good question. I've wondered sometimes, like God, why did you have me go into ministry for 5 years and go to seminary before going into journalism? I think maybe some of the parallels are really caring about people. What I love about covering healthcare is that you get really intimately connected with individual people who are either getting harmed by the system or ripped off financially by the system. And I have in my ministry work and also in my journalism work, I'm a real people person. Like I love to talk to people. I love to meet new people. I'm a very curious person. So I can genuinely be interested in pretty much anything that any other person is doing. And that's helped me a lot. That helped me a lot in ministry when I did youth ministry. It also has helped me a lot in journalism. So I think one of my strengths is having a lot of conversations, connecting with a lot of people, and picking the brains of insiders and experts, and even just individual patients to come up with really interesting stories.
Part of the same question. What led you specifically to healthcare reporting? Was it something that happened in your life, a personal interest in the topic, or some combination of both?
So again, I look at, like you taught, that student made the observation that my career path has not been, planned, right? And I think my wife and I, we got married right after we were in college, and we just prayed that God would help us to be open to doing whatever he wanted us to do. And like my wife had been a missionary kid, so for her, it felt very natural for her to go live in Africa. I had never been outside the United States, but we ended up doing missionary work because we felt God calling us there. But then we said, God, we want to have an open hand and be obedient to wherever you lead us and whatever you call us to do. And so we ended up going from Kenya back to Colorado, where I grew up, to Los Angeles for seminary, to Las Vegas of all places, and now I live in New Jersey and work in New York City. Um, there has been no plan. And so when it comes to covering healthcare, there's been no plan, I would say, other than God kind of leading us each step of the way and us trying to be obedient to what God calls us to do. So when it comes to covering healthcare, I had an editor in Las Vegas in 2006 say, hey, we want you to start covering healthcare. And the first words out of my mouth were, I cannot imagine anything more boring than writing about healthcare. I thought it sounded so dull. You know, I had read so many dumb stories off of press releases, and I was just really down on it. But I said, well, look, if you want me to try it, I'll give it a try. And I found out right away that it was a great beat and a great fit for me, just with my kind of justice streak that I have.
Another question about vaccines. Are you optimistic that these vaccines are going to be effective and widely distributed to the point where they can actually make a dent in this problem?
Yes, I am. And I only say that because I've talked to other experts who are, not because I'm an expert, but I've talked to experts who I respect. And I said, look, are these vaccines, are these for real? Because I'm feeling the same desperation everyone else is. And yeah, they sound incredibly promising and totally unexpected. I mean, these vaccines have never been developed this fast before. And they sound incredibly effective. So I'm very hopeful about it, and I'm hopeful that, you know, maybe in the next 6 months, those can get distributed fairly widely. I think they're going to have to decide who gets them first. I think there's important things to, you know, give them to frontline providers or whoever, but I am hopeful about it.
Can you speak? We've heard all semester, at least I have, from students who, because of the COVID-19 environment, are feeling a different kind of stress, isolation, disruption of routine. In your reporting, have you uncovered anything that indicates that the damage from those sorts of things we haven't even begun to total yet?
Yeah, I think that's underexplored and unknown at this point. And this is where there are fair critiques of the shutdowns, right? Because you shut things down to prevent harm, potential harm, but when you shut things down, you cause actual harm. And so I understand the reasons why things are shut down, but also, you know, unfortunately, this all goes back to the fact that we just didn't have a handle on this thing from the beginning. And so we've been really fighting an uphill battle against the spread of the virus. And so, you know, there wasn't a lot left for us to do other than shut down if we wanted to slow the spread of the thing. And especially back in April and May, when the numbers were going up so high and the hospitals were becoming filled to overflowing, which is also the kind of position we're in right now. We're just in a really difficult position, but I think there's going to be lasting harm that happens to kids and adults, and the problem of loneliness, and we don't really even know what type of harm is happening because of all the isolation. But you know, it is really, really sad.
Do you see any kind of return to pre-COVID-19 life, a normal as we all recognize what normal is, without masks and just no social distancing? Are we ever going to go back to what life was like before this started last February?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if this vaccine works, I think that, you know, like I have kids right now. My oldest son is a freshman in college. He's living at home. He's on Zoom. I have a senior in high school who's hoping to go to college next year, but he is maybe not going to be able to do that. I'm very hopeful that both my boys will be able to be at school next year. I mean, I really hope that happens. And it seems like if this vaccine really is effective and can be distributed, I mean, they're talking about the vaccine starting to be distributed before Christmas. So That's incredibly soon. Um, if enough people could get it, we would have more herd immunity, and maybe things could go back to normal. I just hope that we're prepared for the next time it happens. This isn't the only coronavirus that's going to hit us. It could happen again in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. We don't know when. I just hope we're better prepared. And to be quite honest, I don't have a lot of trust that we will be better prepared next time.
Here's another question. And do you think that there were steps that the U.S. could have taken to prevent the impact that the pandemic has had on our way of life? I mean, was there anything that could have been done so we aren't speaking via Zoom right now? So we could done what South Korea has done and get back to normal sooner.
Yes, but it would require the total restructuring and reprioritizing of our healthcare system. And I don't, that's like, saying, will a, tiger change its stripes? Everybody is making so much money in healthcare the way it is that to suggest that we should change the structure or invest more in public health at the expense of people who are raking in big money and big returns, I'm not sure it's realistic to say that anybody was going to do that. We have responded to this pandemic in just a very American way. It really reflects our American culture. Our individualism comes into play. We don't get told what to do. A big reason why it's been hard is because of our federalist form of government. We have 50 United States, but the federal government is not actually in charge of all the 50 states. And so the CDC is the federal agency involved with the expertise to give advice about the pandemic, but they don't have the authority to control what happens in the states. And that's because of the way our founders put our whole country together. And that's why you see different reactions in different states and even different reactions within states and different counties. It's kind of like our system of government is really, I think, a really excellent one, but it's not well served when it comes to fighting a pandemic. And so I think it's made it harder for the United States to have a unified response, just because of the structure of our public health system, the authority structure, the jurisdiction, and then who we are as Americans. We're very independently minded, and so we don't like to be told what to do.
Questions. We are entertaining any questions. If you want to verbalize your questions, that's fine. Otherwise, you can send them to either me or Catherine on the chat, or just post them in the chat.
I have a quick question. I guess it's probably not going to be quick, but can you talk a little bit about the differences between the reporting that you did in Las Vegas and then the transition into investigative reporting? Like, how is investigative reporting different than traditional news for a local paper?
Well, yeah, I was doing a lot of investigative reporting through my whole career, but I think at the smaller, more local outlets, I was covering a lot more breaking news, informing people just about what was happening in the community, more so than digging and uncovering actual wrongdoing. So I think that's maybe the biggest difference, is just trying to inform people about what's happening is one type of journalism, versus accountability or investigative stories where you're really trying to identify wrongdoing and expose it.
Having worked for both local outlets and now sort of a national, international outlet, I can remember a time where local news outlets used to do a lot more investigative reporting. I mean, TV stations had their own investigative units, which now for the most part have been disbanded. But clearly there's a market for investigative journalism out there. And I'm wondering, I don't know the answer to this, but I just wonder why the local outlets have all but abandoned investigative journalism. I know this, there are realities of budget and staff and things like that. But if there's a market for it and somebody's going to pay attention to it, I can't understand why they don't make more of a commitment to it.
It's expensive to do, so if you look at my work, I might do this year, let's say it's a normal non-pandemic year. I mean, I'm spending weeks or even months on each story. So I might do a series of 5 or 6 hard-hitting stories in a whole year. That's expensive. I mean, if you break it out by story, that is costing a lot of money to do that type of journalism. And so and now in the internet era, people don't want to pay anymore for what they read. I mean, they're so accustomed to getting content for free that, there aren't subscribers to newspapers anymore, and there aren't people who are accustomed to paying for journalism. And so you end up having very high numbers of readers. There's a big appetite for the content, but the business model is broken where people aren't accustomed to paying for it. And so one thing about ProPublica that's great is that we're not trying to make money. I mean, we're one of the newer kind of nonprofit models where we look at it more as a civic good, where we ask wealthy individuals and foundations to donate so that we can do this public service journalism that's very costly, but then we give it away for free. And so our model is to do these in-depth stories and then partner with other publications. Let anybody, we have an actual link on our site that says steal our stories. We let anybody publish our stories with, as long as they credit us and don't change them. And so we're now a philanthropy model as opposed to a for-profit model. And for ProPublica, it's worked, and there are these type of nonprofit outlets that are sprouting up all over the country. And so I just encourage people to subscribe or donate. It is an important part of our country. The First Amendment gives us the freedom of the press, and so it's an important thing to support.
Other questions before I ask another one?
Rich, how many students do you have in your program, and where do they end up going? Where do they end up trying to get jobs? Because it's got to be hard to get jobs these days.
Yeah, I mean, we right now in this environment, it's become difficult because we can't physically send them anywhere. But typically, I mean, we've had people go to newspapers, local TV stations. We have alumni working at CNN, various TV stations around the country, all kinds of media outlets. They're really all over the world. And I would say probably the majority of them in mainstream outlets.
That's great. That's awesome.
I think one of the challenges, though, I think in the current climate, it's so polarized, and we consume media that seems to exist in extremes. You have one extreme over here, one extreme over here, and nobody's really trying to work toward the middle. So I have a lot of students coming to me and saying, I'm not sure where I fit in all of this. I don't, where do I go? If I want to report news, but for whom? I don't fit in at Fox. I don't fit in at CNN. So what is there out there for me? And you want, it's not an easy question to answer, but I think you've helped answer it because you've been at different mainstream secular outlets and have obviously thrived in those places.
It's tough. I just think that starting small is actually really valuable in working your way up. If you can afford to do it, like people always ask me, how do you make it in journalism? The one thing I say is don't have a high standard of living, because the entry level jobs are so poorly paying. But it is hard, and I'm sympathetic to that. I think it's tough. I mean, I almost have survivor's guilt because I'm in a place where it really is a great job, and because our funding has been good, I'm actually in a place that's a fairly secure job right now. But that's just not common throughout the media. I see Annie Brown asked a question here. What is your favorite investigative story you pursued? I have a lot of them. I mean, I think I relish the reporting process probably as much as anything else. Like, to me, the fun of the pursuing a story is one of the most fun things. In fact, let me show you, I'll show you one of my favorite ones here. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen those doctor awards, like America's Top Doctor or Best Doctor. You go to your doctor's office and they have these plaques on the wall. A few years ago, I got a phone call. It was a voicemail, And it was this company, and they were saying, hey, we just wanted to call and talk to you. Hello, Dr. Allen. They thought it was a doctor. Hello, Dr. Allen. We just want to call and congratulate you on being nominated as one of America's top doctors. And I was like, top doctors, tell me more, And I don't know how I got on their list, but clearly they were just calling some list that maybe they got, maybe I went to some conference or something, I don't know. But I called the person back and I said, oh, tell me about this top doctor award. And I've done so many stories about healthcare quality. There is no meaningful measurement of healthcare quality going on in the United States right now where it's reported to the public in a meaningful way. So they love to create these doctor awards that they use for marketing and advertising and to convince patients that they're somehow better than some other doctor, but these awards are meaningless. So I already knew that when I got this call. So I was just taking notes and interested in what they were telling me. So I said, well, tell me more about it. They said, oh, well, you're nominated by your peers. And I said, oh, that's amazing. It's really great. So my peers thought I was a top doctor. They said, yes, congratulations. I said, well, how do I get the plaque? They said, well, it's $299 for the plaque. And I knew that my company, ProPublica, wasn't going to expense a $299 plaque, but I really wanted them to give me this award because I was going to write about it. And so I said, I think I can't do $299, and they said, well, how about $99? And I was like, done, we got it. I said, there is this one problem though. I said, I'm not actually a doctor. I said, I'm a healthcare journalist. I write about doctors. I talk to lots of doctors, but I'm not actually a top doctor. Is that going to be a problem, or can you still give me the award? I had to be honest about it. And the woman, she must have been paid by commission, because she just kind of hesitated for a minute and she goes, oh no, that's no problem. So anyway, they sent me in the mail, I'm a top doctor. So this is my top doctor award, Marshall Allen, top doctor. And I did a reverse image search on Google, and there are dozens and dozens of licensed medical doctors who have this award on their website or on their Facebook page or on their wall of their office. And they asked me, and it even says on the plaque, they said, well, what's your specialty? Because they have to put, are you like an anesthesiologist, or are you like a, cardiologist or something? And I said, well, how about put investigator on there? And so on mine, it says top investigator. And on the plaque, Marshall Allen, top investigator, New York. And this says patient reviews, top doctor certified. So that my brand of medicine is especially qualified, I guess you'd say. But when I got this award in the mail, you're asking me about my favorite investigative story. This was the most delightful thing I've ever gotten. They even asked me what I wanted, the cherry wood finish, which of course you can see it's very classy. It's just part of the board. But when I got that award in the mail, I paraded that thing around the newsroom like it was my newborn baby. I just had to show everybody, So that was a fun one. And then I wrote a column. Let me find my. I'll drop the link in here because I really. I would say one of my specialties is identifying the absurdities of the healthcare system and then writing stories that expose those absurdities and even mock them. So the link here, the headline says, I'm a journalist. Apparently, I'm also one of America's top doctors. And so I wrote about really the game of these top doctor awards and this whole system, this facade that's built up around healthcare quality in the United States.
Well, the first thing I'm doing tomorrow morning is going to my doctor's office and see if he has one of those on his wall.
Definitely. Ask him how they got, how'd you get nominated for that award?
Because I will no longer be impressed.
No, it's not impressive, unfortunately.
How does one, I know when you're a reporter, you get sort of, having done that for a long time, you find yourself reporting on certain things, and all of a sudden it becomes your beat for whatever reason, whether it's politics, business, education, healthcare, and all of a sudden you're, having been a generalist, you find yourself in the position of having all of a sudden to become an expert on a certain topic, in your case, healthcare. How did you get up to speed where you felt you were conversant in healthcare lingo and subject matter?
I mean, just through people very patiently teaching me. And I think one advantage that I kind of bring to these conversations with any expert I talk to is I'm very quick to tell them that I'm not an expert. I don't have any medical training. I'm not a doctor or a nurse. And so I just invite them to help me. I just tell them, look, I can learn, but you're going to have to teach me, you know? And so it's a lot of sources who have the public interest at heart, who see problems in their industry that they want the public to know about. And then they really team up with a journalist and they take a journalist kind of under their wing and help us understand how this complicated system works. I also do a lot of, we call them call outs. So let me show you the one that we did about health insurance. But this is something, if you're a reporter and you have an interest in covering a particular beat, even if you're a freelancer or you're at a smaller media outlet, we'll do these call outs where basically we just post online a short questionnaire. I just put it in the chat. And for this one, when I knew I was going to start covering health insurance in September of 2017, I posted this call out that says health insurance is big and complicated. Help us understand it. And it says ProPublica would like to hear from people who have expertise in some facet of the health insurance industry. It's one of the most important industries in the country and takes up a significant chunk of family budgets. Yet for those outside of it, the industry is difficult to understand. Will you help ProPublica reporter Marshall Allen learn about it? You could walk him through what you do in the industry and help him understand what works and what doesn't. We hope you can identify specific ways that ProPublica can spur improvement. And this call out has now been completed by more than 1,000 people in the health insurance industry. And you can see, I've just asked people here to give me your name, your email, what you do in the industry, so what your job is, what problems they've seen, and is there a sensible way forward for the problems. And it's amazing the number of people who are willing to help journalists if we just ask them for help, and they're willing to guide us if we just ask them for guidance. And so I spent weeks talking to people who process health insurance claims, or actuaries, or people who do customer service for health insurers, people who look at appeals when people have care denied. And I talked to, I mean, dozens of people over a span of a few months. And in each of those conversations, I was learning about the industry. It was all off the record, so they could be free to talk to me about any problems they saw. And then I developed a story list based on all those conversations. Then I pitched those stories to my editors, and I said, okay, I've had weeks of conversations. And I mean, when I take notes, I can type about as fast as people talk. I probably had about 400 pages of single-spaced type notes from these meetings with people. And then from there, I developed stories and ideas I pitched to my editors, and then my editors approved the stories. And then the stories that became part of this series, a lot of those are some of those initial stories that I pitched. And then you keep the call out going. So every time you publish a story, you put a link to the call out with the story, and you ask for more people to give you tips. And so people continue to feed your knowledge and your understanding. And so that's really how I've conducted investigations at ProPublica for quite a few years. I did that with patient safety. I did that with wasted healthcare spending, and then I've done that now with health insurance. And then on day one, when we published our first story about the pandemic, we did a call out for people who were on the front lines of the coronavirus pandemic, asking them also to help us and to help guide our reporting. So it's been, to me, those call outs have been an essential part of what I do to learn.
Any additional questions?
You really seem to love your job at ProPublica, which is great. Where do you see yourself staying with them for as long as possible, or like where do you see yourself going beyond what you're doing?
That's a great question. I do love my job. I always feel like though I'm holding my career in an open hand, you know, and if God were to lead me to do something else, I hope that I would be really open to that. Like writing the book was something that really I wanted to do, because it is true. I've been there a decade now, and you do write a lot of these stories. I'm editing now too, so I have one reporter who I'm editing this year, which has been a great learning experience for me. But you do sort of go, well, in 5 years, am I just going to keep writing more investigative stories? In 10 years, am I going to keep writing more investigative stories? So, you know, I think the book is something I really want to do to kind of challenge myself to grow. The editing has been something that I'm doing to grow. And then I'm open to, you know, I'm planning for next year, just like I do every year, but I'm always open to if God might have something else in store for me.
Well, Marshall, this has been terrific. We really appreciate you joining us. Very, very enlightening. And the book is now available on Amazon as of today.
Yes, in fact, if you order it today, you can say that you were like the first one to order the book. I mean, I don't know how long I can get away with making that as a nudge, but anyway, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I mean, I hope you can tell that this is something I'm very passionate about.
Absolutely. We'd like to see you in person one of these days.
Well, I hope, you know, like if this vaccine works out,
yes,
let's do it next time in real life. And if you come up here, please reach out to me and we can get together. And for any of your students or anybody who ever wants to email me, if anybody has any questions, I always love to connect with students or with younger reporters, or even more experienced reporters. You know, there aren't a lot of us in the business, so I always like to connect with others.
Well, Marshall, thank you again very much. We greatly appreciate it. Hope to see you soon. Catherine, thank you for putting this all together.
Thank you, Catherine.
And to everybody else for joining us. And we have another one of these coming up. You know, off the top of your head, Catherine, when is it? January what?
I believe it's the 27th.
27th. Okay, so put that on your calendar. January 27th. Another one. And that'll be the 4th installment in our series. So thanks, everybody. Marshall, thank you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
We will see you next time. Bye, everybody.